Hello and welcome to the National Archives Foundation's virtual program series. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation. We're the nonprofit partner to the National Archives. Through this foundation programming, we're pleased to open up the virtual doors of the National Archives and share its more than 15 billion records, objects, films, letters, drawings, photographs, and most importantly, the stories of our nation's past. The National Archives Museum in Washington, D.C. is open and it's hopping. Please visit archivesfoundation.org to catch up on the latest at the museum. Or right now, in fact, you can click on the YouTube subscribe button, grow our network, and you'll never miss a program. We have another history-inspired conversation for you this afternoon. This is a live program and our guests will be taking your questions. So please use the YouTube chat to ask your questions. And right now, just to test your skills, throw your hometown and state in there, and I'll give you a shout out later on in the program. The Title IX legislation is on view at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. as of this morning in celebration of the 50th anniversary. And tonight's conversation will center around that famous education legislation. It opened up the world of sports to women like never before. And I should say we couldn't have done this program without the partnership of Lead One, the Association of D1 Athletic Directors. A special thank you to Tom McMillan for his collaboration. Before I introduce our featured speakers, we have some special reflections on Patsy Mink, who was the woman behind the Title IX legislation.
Hi, I'm Jim Blanchard, Chair and President of the National Archives Foundation, and welcome to our program, Title IX, Then and Now. I had the privilege of serving with one of the leaders of the Title IX movement, Congresswoman Patsy Mink of Hawaii. She was a woman of challenge. She was a woman who overcame enormous hurdles and, by the way, was successful at almost everything she touched and did. It was quite a life. She was valedictorian of her high school in Maui. She then applied to medical school and was turned down because 10 medical schools turned her down because she was a woman. They didn't accept women. She finally decided to become a lawyer and was accepted at the University of Chicago. And of course, she was a superstar again. She passed the bar in Hawaii, returned to Hawaii, but no law firm would hire her because she was married to John Mink. It was a mixed marriage. And she was a mother and a woman. She didn't let that stand in her way. She ended up running for Congress, becoming a great ally of President Lyndon Johnson, and was a strong supporter of things like Medicare, Medicaid, and voting rights. But her one big love was getting Title IX enacted, and she was one of the great leaders of that movement that we celebrate now, 50 years later. What a life. When I was in Congress serving with her, she was already an icon. She was a fighter. She cared about everybody, not just her constituents in Hawaii, and she was successful. And that's why in 2002, Congress renamed Title IX, and I want to get this right, the Patsy T. Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act. What an honor and so fitting. I hope you enjoy our program tonight.
Thanks, Jim. And now on to our featured speakers. So first I want to welcome Sarah Axelman. She is the Vice President of Advocacy at the Women's Sports Foundation, having worked in women's sports advocacy for more than a decade. She is a Title IX expert, focusing her work on both grassroots and national initiatives that educate the public and advocate for policies and practices that advance gender equality in sports. She's a proud alum of the University of Mary Washington, where she played 4 years of NCAA varsity softball. We also have Beth Getz, who is the Ball State University's Director of Athletics. She's been there since June of 2018. As director, she provides the leadership for the athletic programs. Prior to arriving at Ball State, she spent the previous 2 years as the Chief Operating Officer and Senior Woman Administrator at the University of Connecticut. Before UConn, Beth served in key leadership roles at the University of Minnesota, Butler University, and the University of Missouri St. Louis. And in college, she was an accomplished Division I student athlete playing soccer at Clemson and Brevard. And our final speaker is Desiree Reid Francois. She's the Director of Athletics at the University of Missouri. Desiree came to Mizzou after serving 4 years as the director of athletics at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She served in senior athletic positions at Virginia Tech, the University of Cincinnati, among others. And notably, before her work in college athletics, she worked as a legal associate for the Oakland Raiders and the NFL's Management Council. And she was a former rowing student athlete at the University of UCLA. Sarah, Beth, and Desiree, can you hear me? I want to make sure I can hear you all. Hi.
Hello, how are you?
Hello.
Excellent. I can hear everyone.
And
All
the
right. Terrific. I'm so glad to have you. I think it's going to be an animated conversation. And I think we should start out. We got a little bit of context from Jim Blanchard, our board president and chair, but I'd like to start out with Sarah to talk, give us a little bit of a history lesson here. The push for Title IX, take us back. What is it? How did it come about? What was its intent? And I'm sure a lot of questions will come from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I'm going to try and boil it down as much as I can and leave some opportunities for more discussion. But first, thank you to the National Archives Foundation for having us. Really excited for this conversation. And, you know, on the week of the 50th anniversary is just a really special opportunity. You know, to understand Title IX, we can kind of talk through a few different of the main context pieces that were happening around the time of its passage. So it was passed in 1972. We know in the 60s and 70s, we see a wider movement for, you know, women's rights happening, the push for the Equal Rights Amendment. All of that is kind of happening in society as this is also bubbling. But women and girls were largely excluded from sports and education. And so in one piece that I want to read, I have a few different quotes that hopefully I can pull from, but in 1971, this I think is a really good example. There was a young girl who in Connecticut who sued for the right to compete on the boys cross country team because they didn't have a team for girls. And in that decision, the judge said, athletic competition builds character in our boys. We do not need that kind of character in our girls, the women of tomorrow. So just before Title IX is passed, and really in that era of the early 70s, this is what women and girls were up against in the opportunity to access sports and access education. Women were receiving just 9% of medical degrees, 1% of dental degrees, and 7% of law degrees. So really being excluded, as we heard Mr. Blanchard say, from educational opportunities. That was not unique to Patsy Mink. That was what women were experiencing. And we saw, you know, at the high school level, girls had fewer than 30,000 opportunities to participate in sports, and at the collegiate level, high school level, fewer than 300,000, at the collegiate level, fewer than 30,000. And all of that happening while at Congress, we're having push for the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 passed, but women, professional women and executive women were excluded from that. So women working in education weren't covered. You also saw the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1974 with Title VI and Title VII, but there were certain exclusions that still didn't really bring it to the educational system. And so what happened was there was an executive order 11375, which amended Executive Order 11246, which essentially it prohibited sex-based discrimination for those who received federal contracts. And it was this executive order that was really key for Dr. Bernie Sandler, who is a huge advocate, that, you know, she really saw this as what she called a eureka moment, right? That she was sitting at home and she saw this essentially a footnote in a book, and saw this executive order as the opportunity to start to push back against sex-based discrimination in educational institutions. And so she actually filed 250 complaints on sex-based discrimination, and that really laid the groundwork for Title IX. And as we saw that starting, there were also congressional hearings on sex-based discrimination from Representative Edith Green, who is another, you know, big figure in the push for Title IX. And Senator Birchby is that final figurehead that, you know, we often talk about when we talk about some of the key folks who were involved in the passage of this legislation. And he actually took an education provision from the Equal Rights Amendment and moved that over to the Higher Education Amendments of 1972. And that's how we actually have the Title IX that we know today is that it was a piece that was actually attached to the ERA that he also attempted to push through the educational piece, push through the higher education amendments. And so in 37 simple words, Title IX says that you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex in educational programs that receive federal financial assistance. And at the time that was part of the higher education amendments, it really didn't have much pushback, because I think a lot of folks at the time didn't really see that there was sex-based discrimination in educational programs and didn't necessarily see that athletics would fall under this as well. So once it became clear what it actually meant and what it meant for athletics, there were many opportunities and attempts to fight back against it. We saw something called the Tower Amendment that was an attempt to exclude football and other revenue-producing sports, which was defeated, but we have the Javits Amendment, which basically says you can take into account the type of sport and what's necessary for the sport to run, so it's not dollar for dollar. So Title IX has had many challenges over the years, but we have seen such great progress. And now in the 50th anniversary year, really looking forward to talking about that progress and really making sure that folks understand how far we've come, but also the work that still remains.
Terrific. That was a wonderful overview. I want to get Beth and Desiree in here. You're both in highly influential, high profile positions in athletics. But for our viewers, I know we had a chance to chat, obviously, before the program. Can we go back and talk a little bit about your personal experiences with sports and your connection to sport, and sort of how we'll get into the athletic directors and running, big athletic departments. But I'm interested in your personal story, because you really have one that connects to the legacy of Title IX. We'll just start alphabetically. So Beth, why don't you jump in first?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this. When I was a young kid, my mom was always the athlete in my family. And so I'm the oldest of four girls, and they always wanted us to have an opportunity to participate in sport. And so at the time, I knew my mom had played a little basketball. She used to play on a softball league in the summer. We would watch. And so I had all of these opportunities to participate in as many sports as I wanted to. And so that led to a lot of things for me personally. I mean, it was where I found my confidence, where I found my voice, and ultimately where I found my passion. And one of the things I always find so interesting, it took me until adulthood to really understand how her athletic experience was different than mine, and to really recognize so many women whose shoulders we get to stand on now. Because she always told me she played half court basketball, which to me meant, you're checking the ball at half court and switching possession, until I took her to her first WNBA game. And she starts explaining to me that they weren't they only had one person who was called a rover that could go back and forth and cross the line. And so it really let me know how far we'd come. And to have the opportunity to have access to an athletic scholarship and access to education, and compete as certainly a high school athlete, but then on in college, and have the opportunity to coach and do administration. It's really just been at the core of who I am and what I've been able to do. So there's not a day in which I'm not grateful for the opportunities we have, and they all lead back to this special amendment for sure.
Great.
Similar to Beth, my mother was an incredible athlete, and she grew up in an era, she was born in 1945, where unless you played golf or tennis or a country club sport, there really weren't very many opportunities. And I'm half Mexican, half English. And playing on my first soccer team when I was 3 years old, it was the Huggy Bears. We were brown and gold, and I was not quite the daisy picker in the center halfback, but I wasn't too far away. I'm remarkably uncoordinated. But one thing that sports has done for me is I'm really competitive. And growing up as a Latinx female, sports was a way that I could be competitive, and it was okay. I wasn't judged any differently. I don't think it's any mistake that 94% of our Fortune 500 female CEOs are former high school student athletes. The benefits that I learned, similar to what Beth was talking about. I mean, we make our life's work being able to provide opportunities. I know I would not be on this Zoom, and I'm remiss in saying thank you to the National Archives Foundation. It is a true a privilege and an honor to be able to be on this panel and to be alongside Sarah and Beth and Patrick. So thank you very much. But I know I would not be here if it wasn't for Title IX and what Title IX has done for us. Title IX, it's part of America's story. And any civil rights law, it's about access and equity, but it's also what I felt was it's about growth and opportunity. And it's just a privilege every day to be able to see our student athletes and to be able to see the impact that Title IX has made on them. And similar to what Beth said, to stand on the shoulders of those that have come before us, it's just truly an honor. And it's something that I don't take for granted. So while my student athlete story, like I said, I'm really uncoordinated. I was a walk-on rower at UCLA only because I wasn't good enough to run track. But you know what? I was able to compete. And I've been on every single team. And I know how sports doesn't only just help our cognitive skills and our emotional development and our social and our mental development, but sports teaches us teamwork. And it makes inherently those of us that have played sports, we know we have to make others around us better. So that's why I say that Title IX is part of America's story, because it's not just women who have benefited from Title IX, it's all of us.
That's great. And that's a great segue, Sarah. I wanted to ask you, you sort of talk about its challenges from a policy standpoint, but you mentioned some of the statistics, and we just heard a few others of the sort of the limitations in the moment when it was passed. Can you talk a little bit about how it's evolved over the last 50 years in terms of access? And then have there been other sort of key moments where they've been challenged or it's been stunted, whether it's from a policy standpoint or otherwise?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think it's also important to note that Title IX is about sex discrimination in education, and it's most widely known for its application to athletics, but it really addresses all aspects of our educational opportunities. And so really understanding that this is about everything from the ability for women and girls to access, STEM fields that maybe they were traditionally excluded from, or for men to pursue non-traditional fields as well, right? The Title IX is really important for ending sex discrimination. We've seen challenges, we've seen improvements. The progress that we have made, we've seen exponential growth in the opportunities for girls and women to participate in sports. But what we also know is that girls in high school today still have not reached the same level of participation opportunities that boys had before Title IX was passed. And so while we've made great progress, we still have a lot more work to do, because for us, it's so important to make sure that all girls are accessing those lifelong benefits that Desiree just mentioned, right? It's so important to make sure that they have access to the health and academic skills, the career outcomes. It's wildly important to make sure that we're offering these educational opportunities equitably to all of our students. And Title IX has faced challenges over time, whether it's, in the 1980s, there was a series of years where it was essentially not enforced at all. The regs came out around 1975. So there were a few years for the regs to be developed after the passage of the law, and really to understand how it actually applies and how it's enforced. But there was a period of time where it wasn't enforced at all. And then there was a period of time in the early 2000s where there's essentially what we call a loophole, right? Where assessing the interests of student athletes and students in general was, changed, and it was not necessarily in the favor of girls and women. And so there have been challenges and changes over time, and especially in the college space, right? It's an ever-changing landscape. And so making sure that as changes are happening in the college space, that Title IX is keeping up, and that we're keeping Title IX in mind and how it may apply to some of the challenges and changes that we see in the college athletic space as well.
Well, I think we're in the history business here at the Archives. There's plenty of examples in our past where legislation has been passed, including constitutional amendments, and the interpretation, how it gets implemented has many interpretations across our country over time. And of course, those things sort themselves out. usually for the better. Sometimes it takes even more legislation to get there. But I think that's the progress thing. So getting back to Beth and Desiree, like the work that you do, how does Title IX impact the female athletes today? Obviously, you were athletes yourselves. You experienced it, and if you were kind of, excuse the phrase, but babies of Title IX, you had the opportunity to sort of to come out of the shadow of Title IX. And what are you seeing now? Because you're seeing elite athletes in your programs. That funnels down into high school and obviously earlier than that. I'm definitely interested in your perspective on its progress, if you will.
Beth, do you want to go first? And Beth has a really unique perspective too, because she's a former coach. So she has a lot of different lenses. So I'm happy to follow your lead, Beth.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing to think about their perspective as young people when they arrive on a college campus at 18. And part of the progress that both Sarah and Desiree speak about is that we almost have to educate them about how far we have come. So it's a wonderful thing for them to arrive on campus and believe that they are entitled to participate in sport. And so I think that's a really exciting part of the progress that we get to celebrate. But it is ongoing. And so they do experience, particularly, I think, over the last couple of years, they witness firsthand our struggle, I think, consistently in higher ed and in athletics at the professional level and at the high school level. To meet all aspects of Title IX. And so how are you balancing what that looks like in a particular campus or a particular conference as sport has become big business both for men and for many of our women's sports as well, both here in the United States and across the world. So I think that is a part of the conversation that we have to lean into, that we have to talk to our student athletes about, so that they can help us continue to move this in the direction that we want it to go.
There's not much more that I would add to what Beth so eloquently said, but it's an expectation, and it's a wonderful expectation. I love the fact, and I cannot wait for the day. And I don't know, Beth, if you've experienced this too, but sometimes you get asked, what's it like to be a female AD? And what I used to answer it kind of flippantly. And I would say, well, I don't know how to be a man. So how about you just ask me, what's it like to be an athletic director? What's it like to be a leader? And then I got to the University of Missouri and I was meeting with my women's soccer team. And I saw that it mattered. What our gender represented, and I thought I needed to be much more thoughtful on this. And so now, and what I told them is, I cannot wait for the day when you are a CEO, or when you are a female, or when you are a 5-star general, and no one asks you, what is it like to be a female 5-star general? What's it like to be a female head of your law firm? It's just, what's it like to be a great leader? That's what I'm really encouraged. And when I see our student athletes today, it fills me with hope.
That's another great segue to you mentioned a reference point of some research about leadership in the business world. I'm curious, obviously you're both in education institutions, how you see sport developing youth leadership opportunities as adults. So you're there speaking to the soccer team, encouraging them to think about their leadership skills. And if you're playing, obviously, the D1 level, you've put in a lot of time on the practice field along the way. But the translation of these life skills, can you talk a little bit about that? And whoever wants to jump in.
Go ahead, Desiree, kick us off this time.
Okay. We're women, we're like teamwork, right? Like, no, you go first. No, you go first. Anyway, I spoke yesterday. We have the Missouri Scholars Academy, and it is for the best and the brightest high school students in the state of Missouri. And I spoke to these rising juniors, and it was young men and young women. And one thing I was so encouraged about yesterday, and I left there just filled with hope that it wasn't even it wasn't even an issue gender. It wasn't, there was just such this wonderful acceptance. Well, this is how it's supposed to be. And similar to Beth and I have seen the evolution of our enterprise. We had Debbie Yao, who was one of the pioneers in college athletics. Debbie Yao was an athletic director for 29 years at NC State, Maryland, St. Louis University. And really, because of her great work, it opened the door for Beth and I to come through. And she talked to our staff today, and we talked, and she was the only woman in the room in the ACC for 22 years. And, in our respective leagues, in the SEC, we have another female athletic director, Vanderbilt, and Candace Lee, who's this incredibly talented woman. And Beth, I know, has other women in her league as well. But that's because of the great work and the progress of people like Debbie Yao and the Sandy Barbers of the world. And so now we've seen a little bit of an evolution, and now we have, I think, 10 or so female ADs in Division 1 FBS, 5 at the A5 and 5 at the G5. And so when I was talking to our young high school students yesterday, I just thought this is what progress looks like when people don't, when it's just irrelevant what our gender is. And it's just maybe it's not irrelevant, maybe that's not the right word, maybe it's more of just an acceptance that of course females can be leaders. And I think that's directly attributed to what Title IX has done, because Sarah brought up a really good point. About 7% of women pre-Title IX were law students, and 9% were medical students. Well, you know what? Today, 54% of women are law students, and 53.7% of medical students are women. And that's the impact when I talk about Title IX being part of America's story.
Yeah, that's really well said, Desiree. And I think what is so neat, and a few of your examples is, and this is true about all types of diversity, but young people need to see themselves in their leaders. They need to be able to visualize what they aspire to be, whether professionally or from an athletic standpoint. And I just think that's so critically important. Patrick, you ask about sort of those intangible skills that you get from sport, and at its core, engagement in something is really important, be it music or theater, and that's just those are the types of things that help keep our young men and women on the right track and aspiring to be more. But I think in sport we hear a lot about teamwork and time commitment and all of those things, which I think are incredibly true. I think my experience, one of the things that and research points to this as well, that we see particularly in women, is resilience, right? In sport, we fail more than we succeed. It's if you're hitting 300 in softball, that's a pretty good batting average, and it means you're failing more often than you're successful, right? And I think the ability to evaluate, to respond, to figure out a different way to go about those things, and to do it, to do it in a way that you're not discouraged, that you just aspire to try again. I think that's one of the critical pieces we see. And so whether that happens because you don't do as well as you think you can on an exam in the classroom, or as you're studying or you're interviewing for a job that you don't get, I think that skill that is inherently a part of sport is one for me that just really resonates, and that you want your student athletes to lean on. And so we actually try to celebrate those failures just as much as you celebrate successes, because I think those become interwoven into who they're going to be and what they're going to achieve down the road.
At next play, right, Beth?
That's right.
Next play. And Sarah, you know this too. You were a competitive softball player. Next pitch, right? Like you start off, but you get back up, and you're like, who wouldn't want to hire a student athlete? We make others around us better. And yes, Beth and I make our life's work with student athletes, but shameless plug for all of our student athletes that play, regardless of gender. They're incredible leaders because that's part of their DNA.
And I would just add, right, I know Beth and Desiree, you're both, working with some of our most elite athletes, but those lessons to deal with failure, to work, teamwork, time management, that happens at all levels of sport. And so when we talk about those sport experiences, it's important to remind ourselves that it is those intangibles, and it is just that the opportunity to access sports and all of the lifelong benefits that can provide, whether you're participating and competing at the most elite levels, or, it's a young kid that's playing little league and just for the fun of it, and not at a super elite or super competitive level, that everyone is getting those types of benefits, and it's bettering our society as a whole.
So I want to follow up on some statistics. Desiree, you mentioned the number of, what is the percentage of women who are CEOs that played sports?
94%. It was an Ernst & Young study a couple of years ago, right, Beth?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's 10 female athletic directors currently. Out of how many? I want to give a little perspective. I'm curious about in your field. Obviously, you took two different paths to get to the positions you were in. Are you seeing more interest by female athletes to get into the field, whether it be sports marketing, it's administration, obviously coaching, all of those aspects? What are you seeing inside of like athletics sort of writ large?
Yeah, well, there's 130 FBS, so football playing institutions. So the 10 number that Desiree referred to in terms of female athletic directors is in Division I at football playing institution. I think across Division I, that number isn't significantly larger. I want to say around 25, although I could be off on that. But and then there are greater numbers at Division II, Division III in college. And Sarah may have some stats here, but the interesting piece about that breakdown is that with the passing of Title IX and these opportunities, one would assume that there are more women in these roles. But as those opportunities professionally began to provide greater salaries and income, there were those positions became filled by many men as well. And so that's one of the things that I think we see today, is that there are still fewer women that are engaged. And I don't believe that's because there are fewer women that are qualified or fewer women that are interested in these positions as coaches or as administrators at any level, but because people are excited and passionate and want an opportunity to compete. And so we're starting to see some of that. I also think there are some nuances that industries, certainly the one that we work in, but many industries still struggle with, as many women have families and young children. And sometimes that is more of a challenge in an industry where it often requires lots of travel, significant nights, significant weekends. You move cross country for opportunities in the college landscape. And so with that opportunity, for all of these new employment options at the collegiate level has come with it its own challenges. And so I know one of the things we're really passionate about, and I know Desiree certainly is a great mentor to young people, is how do we get young women to not only get in the industry, but to stay in the industry. And that's still a challenge that we face. And I think that's probably true at most levels.
Yeah, and Beth, to add to that, so prior to the passage of Title IX, 90% of coaches of women's teams were women. And today, of collegiate teams, today that number is around 40 or 41%, right? And that is all while the percentage of women coaching men's collegiate teams has remained pretty stagnant and in the single digits. So women have certainly, the size of the pie may have grown as we added more opportunities for women to compete. But the proportion of the opportunities that women have to coach, especially on the women's side, has decreased. And I think it's really important to point to the role models, right? If you can see it, you can be it. So for, Beth and Desiree to be visible and to be out there, that's so important. And to know that investing in diverse candidates and searches, will help you have a better department, that it's not just the right thing to do, it's a really good business decision. And so for us at the Women's Sports Foundation, we also invest in the pipeline and provide grants to institutions of higher education that are looking to invest in up and coming women coaches. And part of that is to really make sure that they have the opportunity to succeed. And that's by, not having to work 5 jobs, right? Getting a salary that allows you to actually focus on the coaching duties, and also to invest in the mentorship and professional development, because so much of getting those jobs is about who you know, who knows you, what conferences you've been to, what skills you have. And so really investing in that professional development of the up and coming coaches as well. One of the things that happened when Title IX passed was that a lot of athletic departments that were previously split, the men's athletic department and the women's athletic department combined. And so you had a combined department. And in all but one instance, the man who was in charge of the men's athletic department remained in charge of that combined department. And so we know that people hire people with similar backgrounds to themselves and from their own networks, and hire people who look like them. And so making sure that as we have these new opportunities to hire, that we're really trying to very consciously break the status quo.
Desiree, any thoughts you want to add?
The importance of context, I just want to underscore that. Justice Sotomayor, in her book, I think it's My Beloved World, talked about the critical importance of providing context. Beth and Sarah and we all have a responsibility to do that, to provide context, but we have to do great work because we have to keep the door open, but we also have a really big responsibility, just like Debbie Yao did for me. And I bet Sarah and Beth have incredible mentors that aren't just women, right? That are men too. We, the 3 of us, have got to do a great job of bringing others along with us and making sure that that we keep that incredible pipeline healthy and robust and encouraged. And yes, there is a lot of work to do, but I am so hopeful for the future. When I look yesterday, when I saw those high school students, and when I see my student athletes here, there's so, and like when Beth and I go to our professional industry and you meet women that are in this industry, and I am just so incredibly hopeful, and I just want to be their biggest cheerleader and their biggest advocate, because there is so much talent out there, and we've got to do a good job of bringing everybody along with us.
That's a very good point. You're warming up the comments in the YouTube with this conversation. I'll just throw that out there, as you can imagine. I have several more questions. I know we want to get to some of that Q&A, so I want to encourage folks to throw your questions in the chat. We'll try and get to some of those. And just while those are rolling in, it is an exciting week for the archives. We put the Title IX legislation on view. And I will also mention that this fall, we're opening up our first ever exhibition that explores sports in the federal government. It'll be very exciting. And the Title IX legislation will be on view when that exhibit opens as well. So if you can't make it in the next couple of weeks to the National Archives in DC, you have the chance this fall to visit me, see that exhibition. Here's one for each of you. You've sort of talked about this anniversary, the big moment, how far things have come. How are you and your institutions celebrating this milestone? I know you're part of larger associations that might be doing that. I think our audience would be interested in how you're looking at the Title IX anniversary, whether it be with students, with your universities. And I know obviously the Women's Sports Foundation is very active here in Washington this week. So love to give some highlights to the viewers.
We're doing a 50 for 50 campaign and 50 stories. And so we have 50 folks that we are approaching to give $50,000 over the next 5 years. And that's benefiting exclusively women's sports facilities. And then we're telling stories of the pioneers that are associated with our state and with our university. Because I probably didn't understand this as well when I was first coming up, but now that I'm in my 25th year in college athletics, I'm probably appreciating it even more. Those folks that came before us, their stories are really important to preserve. They're important to hear because of that context piece. So I want to preserve those. We want to preserve those stories.
Beth or Sarah?
Title IX is just so central and so core to who we are as the Women's Sports Foundation. So as you can imagine, it's not just this week for us. We've been celebrating the anniversary throughout the year, starting with our kickoff of National Girls and Women in Sports Day this past February, in a virtual 5K and 50-mile challenge. That was the first that we've done of that, and using that to really kick off our activations around the 50th anniversary. We have a brand new research report out that looks at the opportunity, the progress that we've made, but really also the room that we have and the work that we still have left. And that includes policy recommendations and action items. So I encourage folks to check that out, because that kind of breaks down some of the action steps, whether it's policymakers at the local level, federal level, or just what an individual can do. And really, one of the simplest things is to better understand the law. We know there's research that shows so many folks just really have not been explicitly taught about Title IX, especially as it relates to athletics. So understanding the law that way, if you are ever in a situation where something isn't equitable for yourself or for someone else in your life, you know enough to ask the questions and to advocate for more equality. And so this week, though, for our activations, we will have a field day event with the Department of Education tomorrow, which we're very excited about. And then on Thursday, we are hosting a panel discussion on Capitol Hill in a House office building in collaboration with the Democratic Women's Caucus. And then throughout from spring to fall, we're having a virtual town hall series around the 50th anniversary of Title IX, really pulling out some of those major themes that we're seeing in the research report and having more nuanced conversations, because as you can imagine, it's a really big report and really important information. So having more nuanced and targeted conversations on different aspects of the report, like access for girls of color, right? That's one area where we know Title IX has fallen short. And so having those conversations in a really targeted and cohesive way to draw attention to the things that we really want to talk about.
And the only thing I would add, and maybe just to speak from a conference standpoint, both in my conference, the Mid-American, but you're seeing this in the SEC, and actually the NCAA is doing the same thing, which is to make this a year-long celebration. And so I think sometimes, when you celebrate a day, it's sort of in and out messages, but I think folks that are watching, any NCAA championship right now, you're going to see the SEC advertisements that are geared towards celebrating their pioneers, and that is certainly true for all NCAA sports, and we are doing that across all of our sports, men's and women's, here in the Mid-American Conference. So I think it's a good way to make what is a great celebration day of a day, extend it and make sure it's a topic of conversation for the entire year.
Really good point. Commissioner Sankey, who was our commissioner in the Southeastern Conference, really wanted to make sure, like Beth was saying, that it wasn't in and out one day only. So we've celebrated it all year, but Commissioner Sankey also is an advocate, and he's an advocate for fairness, and he's an advocate for access and opportunity. And so he's really living those values, and it's very encouraging to see. And I think the advocacy piece is so critical for us to continue to grow into that next iteration and evolve into that next iteration of Title IX.
Well, I really want to encourage these questions coming in here, and I don't want to dominate and take up all of our audience time for questions. So before we jump to those, I want to thank everyone who's threw in their hometown. We've got Arkansas, Connecticut, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Nevada, North Dakota, many places in California. The DC metro area is well represented. Albuquerque, St. Louis, Maryland, New Jersey. We've got a national audience here. So enjoying this conversation, and thank you for your questions. So let me jump to a couple of those here. We've got a few minutes for audience questions. Interesting question just came in. Only a handful of states require PE in K through 12. Has Title IX elevated the status of elite students and diminished the participation of all young people? Be curious if you all have an opinion on that. Is there a direct link there, or is that more of a separate policy issue at the state level?
I want to be thoughtful in this answer, but I do know one statistic that pre-Title IX, 300,000 girls played high school sports. Today, 3.5 million high school girls play sports. So yes, we've focused a lot on Division One NCAA student athletes, but the impact, when you just look at participation numbers, and I know that the question was a little bit broader than that, but that would be my blush. When you look at, gosh, what is that, 10x of participation numbers, I'd say that's been a really positive impact.
Any other thoughts on that?
I would say I think it's somewhat separate, right? Because Title IX is about sex discrimination, and schools and states that are eliminating PE for boys and girls, all students, that is kind of separate from Title IX, but still disheartening, right? And still really concerning. And we want to make sure that kids have the ability to get active and move their bodies. And we know the health benefits of organized sports in the competitive sense, but also of the health benefits of being able to move your body and get physical activity. So while there could be some nuance to the conversation around some of the ties, I think to some extent there might be slightly separate.
Good point, Sarah. Good point. And also the benefits for a community too. When you have an active community, it benefits everybody.
So I know we've seen as a country, obviously, individual athletes be successful, say at the Olympics. Can we draw a line from Title IX to the women's soccer team that everyone sort of has rallied around? What's your take on that?
All right, Beth has got to take this because she's like an elite level soccer player.
I figured that was an easy one.
It is, and I'm not an elite athlete, but soccer obviously was the sport that I was most passionate about. But even when I think back, to the women's national team back in the day of Mia Hamm and some of these large names. I mean, I remember that being Mia Hamm's name being the first time I'd really seen a woman's name on the back of a jersey when you were walking down the street. And that was, again, has a lot to do with, them being on TV and the access. They were now in our homes. I think they were one of those programs that over time had a lot of personality, whether people were soccer fans or just sports fans. But each iteration of those national teams, I think, really found their way into the hearts of people across the country, and certainly young girls who looked at them. And you fast forward today, and now they are leading efforts around equal pay and all of those different types of things. So I really do think that was a part of the story. I know for me, Missouri is my home state, and they didn't have a women's soccer team. And so I think that was just the tie, to that sport, and being able to really expand offerings for women, along the way was really, really important. So, and I played for my coach, Tracy Bates Leone, was a member of the United States World Cup team back in the day. So pretty important piece, I think, for most of us in sport.
Well, that's a great segue to another viewer question about how do we get more TV coverage of women's sports? I think ESPN has helped with that. But your thoughts on that?
I would say the first thing that comes to mind is tune in, right? Prove the point, show that there is an audience for women's sports, show the viewership numbers. And we've seen it. We've seen it with the Women's Final Four, Women's College World Series, the Women's World Cup. There are fantastic viewership numbers that show that there is an appetite and audience for women's sports. So number one, tune in, make sure that you are engaging with your favorite teams and your favorite sports. And for those maybe on the more corporate side of things, invest, right? That there always seems to be this circular conversation around, are you going to invest in it? Is there an audience for it? Show up to the games in person, show up on TV, tune in, but also invest in women's sports, whether it's at the collegiate level, at the professional level. Women's sports is a good business decision, right? In so many different areas. And, that's what I would say is really just make sure you're showing up.
And it's great entertainment. My goodness, it's phenomenal. you cannot have watched the Women's College World Series or watch a volleyball match. And you can't, I mean, just, it was fun when I was going through the airport the other day and to see people's phones, just looking over their shoulders and see people tuning into their phones and watching the Women's College World Series. 5 years ago, we might not have seen that. It is a great activity to go to and just to tune in, like Sarah says.
And sort of on a related front, in a new frontier, and I know in collegiate sports, so the name, image, likeness conversation has obviously exploded on the men's side of sports. One of our viewers is asking how that might affect future opportunities for women in collegiate athletics.
I think two of the first $1 million deals were the Cavender twins out of Fresno State, and they've since transferred from Fresno State. The biggest social media following in our league is by an LSU gymnast. So I think women that are brand savvy are really making a mark, and it's really impressive. Is there room for growth? Absolutely. Name, image, and likeness is this new frontier, but it's a great opportunity for our students. There's going to be bumps and bruises along the way. There just are, because it's such a big shift. But anytime you have progress, that's what you're going to have. So it's a constant evolution. We all don't have it figured out, but we're going to get there because it's in the best interest of our students.
And I think we could probably spend an entire panel just kind of scraping the surface of name, image, and likeness, right? There is so much nuance and complexity to that question that I don't think we really have the time to really dig in. But, you know, to Desiree's point, NIL has been really good for some women. And there are a lot of women who are using this opportunity to make money for themselves. And for some of them in some of their sports, college is the pinnacle. Right? College is the biggest opportunity for them to excel at the highest levels of their sport. So in that respect, it's been very good. I think there are also concerns where there are other deals where maybe are more like team oriented. And that's where there are questions around, how does Title IX apply? Is the school involved? And that's all things that are going to have to get sorted out, because as a general rule of thumb, if the school is involved, whether that's an in-kind donation to a team in a general, benefits and services, or potentially an NIL deal, Title IX most likely applies. And so really understanding that there are different ways that NIL deals are really manifesting right now, that there are the direct to the athlete, big name, big social media presence deals. And then there are others that are a little bit more in a gray area.
Beth, anything to add?
But the one thing I would just note that I thought was really interesting with the Final Fours in basketball, both men's and women's, the top 10 media followings and brand analysis showed that the top 6 were female. So in the top 10, the top followings they had were mostly women. And so you look at athletes like in women's basketball, like Paige Beckers, and there's just so many of them that have really been able to utilize their platform in a way that has been beneficial to them from that standpoint, but also just speaks to a handful of things we've talked about tonight, including are people interested in women's sports? And the answer to that is yes. They want to see these amazing athletes compete, and certainly there's a financial interest there, both corporately and often individually.
That's great. Well, there's unfortunately, a number of questions left unanswered in the queue and on my sheet of paper here. So that just means we're going to have to keep talking about Title IX and women in sports, which is going to be easy to do with our sports show coming up. This has been a terrific conversation. I know one of the things I'd like to, if we have you all back, is talk about the future. We talked a little bit about the past, and one of our viewers wanted to remind us that President Nixon signed the Title IX legislation. He had 2 daughters. So I think it's worth noting there. So a special thank you for your time, your insights, your perspectives. and your contributions to what you're doing every day. To Sarah, Beth, and Desiree, thank you so much, your leadership in women in sports. And I look forward to continuing the conversation, both online and in the coming months. Like you say, this isn't just about stamping a day where we say it's 50, isn't this great, we celebrate, but this is definitely an ongoing conversation. So with that, I will thank you and give you the rest of your evening back. I have a few announcements for our viewers of some programs and things coming up. As we close things out, special thanks to our generous members and corporate supporters and donors. If you'd like to become a member of the foundation, you can join today by visiting our website, archivesfoundation.org. Also want to thank our foundation staff who make these programs happen, program logistics, prep, and promotion, Val McVeigh, Liana Escalise, and of course, our guardian of all these virtual programs, Jim Dumas. Follow us on social media at archivesfdn or visit our website, sign up for our weekly emails. You can also join us on June 27th for our next program that's coming up real soon. Next week, Gen Z Stewards of Democracy. We'll be talking to some young people who work across the country to advance the conversation around civics, getting the public interested in civics and history. I think it'll be a really interesting perspective. So I hope you'll sign up and join us on the 27th. And shopping at the archives is always sporty, whether you do it online or in our museum. Visit us online at nationalarchivestore.org. Go get your shopping groove on. The National Archives is our nation's memory. What is past is prologue. Until next time, on behalf of the National Archives Foundation, thank you for joining us today.